Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this another launch of another book by our amazing Yves Engler. First of all, just I'd like to remind you all that we're on, the university is built on territory that was taken by force without consent and without any recompense at the time or since, and without any sharing since. So maybe we could all during the next coming weeks do something to acknowledge that or pay back that, like do something vigorous to stop Site C and save the Treaty 8 stop the Treaty 8 violations. Having said that, I would now like to, I have the honor to introduce our very special guest tonight, who's here to launch his 9th book, published in the last 11 years. An extraordinary body of work put out by a man who some people have called one of Canada's most important voices on the left, and the Georgia Strait dubbed him that Canada's answer to Noam Chomsky. Suffice to say that all of Yves' books are very well researched and provide a very fulsome picture of what the Canadian government is doing ostensibly on your behalf in many sectors. This book that he's going to be talking about tonight describes the very important use of propaganda to persuade you to accept or to lull you into quiet acquiescence for many wrongs, including war and other abuses of profit-making activity. So without, I urge you all to, Yves has quite a few of his books for sale tonight, and he'll be selling them and perhaps signing them. I assume that many of you have read his books and you won't regret reading another one of them. On that note, I would like to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Yves, for your scholarship and your activism, and for coming to Vancouver to talk to us about your very important book.
Thanks, Gail, and thanks to the sponsors of the event tonight, the organizers, Lawyers Against the War. Also want to thank rabble.ca for helping to promote the event, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. This is part of the cross-country tour for my latest book, A Propaganda System, How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And basically this is a book about information dissemination and suppression in Canadian foreign policy. It's trying to answer the question, why are we so confused about our government's place in the world? Despite a long history of Canada sporting empire, historically the British, today the American, advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad, Canadians overwhelmingly think this country is a force for good internationally. So this book is trying to answer that question. Why is that? Why is the difference between the reality and the perception? And the first thing I'd like to ask people in the room is, how many people think this book is going to be reviewed by the Vancouver Sun, by the Globe and Mail, by the Toronto Star? So we have some cynics in the room, probably rightfully so. It's very, in my opinion, very unlikely that any of those media outlets will review this book. My experience writing 6 previous books critical of Canadian foreign policy, there's very little room for critical discussion or discussion of critical books about Canadian foreign policy. I think The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's foreign policy, the only mention it got in the dominant media was a brief little mention in the column in the Toronto Star. Canada and Haiti waging war on the poor majority, co-authored with Anthony Fenton. I believe it got a mention in the Toronto Star in a column, and then 5 years after it was published, after the earthquake in Haiti, the book section of the Globe Mail gave it about 15 words. My Canada and Israel building apartheid, the only time that was mentioned by a corporate media outlet was when the London Free Press reviewed it. by a sympathetic professor at Western University in London. The next week, there was a counter review. I've never seen a counter review before, but I was lucky to have had one. The only book of mine that's really been reviewed by a major paper in this country, the Halifax Chronicle Herald have reviewed two of my books, I believe, fairly sympathetically. But the only major paper, if you don't count the Halifax Chronicle Herald, was the Montreal Gazette. I live in Montreal now. I'd been hassling the Gazette to review my Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. Once it got shortlisted for the Quebec Nonfiction Writers Prize, they finally said, okay, we will review the book, and they reviewed it. This is part of what the reviewer had to say. Readers who haven't spent their formative years having Marxism-Leninism hammered into their heads might find Engler's approach very refreshing. It transported me back to my days as a university student in the Soviet Union to a pre-perestroika class in Marxist-Leninist political economics. So it, of course, was a highly dismissive review, but any attention is better than no attention. So I got on the phone to all the CanWest book editors across the country and said, "Hey, there's this review in your wire service. Please put it in your paper." And a couple of them did. So my experience in writing books critical of Canadian foreign policy is there's very little room in the dominant media to discuss the matter. My experience writing op-eds, opinion pieces, is more or less the same. So over the past 12 years or so, I've written dozens and dozens of op-eds critical of different elements of Canadian foreign policy that I submitted to different major papers across the country. I believe I've had 4 of them published. And I know what people are thinking now. They're like, okay, this guy doesn't know anything, he can't write. But in fact, my experience writing on domestic issues is actually quite different. So in the early 2000s, when I started to get politicized and started writing, I actually got about a half dozen op-eds published in major dailies out of a submission ratio of about a dozen, so about half of them published. More recently, I worked for the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union, and one of the things I did was I wrote op-eds for the president on behalf of the president of the union, and I got about a dozen of those op-eds published. Pretty much everything that was submitted was able to get published in major papers in this country. Of course, those came with the institutional heft of the union, but they were all dealing with domestic issues, critical, sometimes pushing the bounds, calling for economic democracy, challenging inequality, etc., but dealing with domestic issues. So my point in saying all this is not to say that there isn't a bias in favor of the corporate perspective, in favor of the elite perspective on domestic issues in the dominant media. There is. That bias is that much worse when it comes to foreign policy issues. A very narrow range of debate is allowed in the dominant media in this country when it comes to challenging Canadian foreign policy. And my some of the anecdotes I just mentioned highlight the issue, and in the book I detail many different combination of personal anecdotes and other more broad examples. So, one personal example, about 13 months ago, during the launch of the Canada and Africa 300 Years in Aid and Exploitation book, I submitted an op-ed during the launch in Saskatoon to the Saskatoon Star Phoenix op-ed editor about Potash Corps, a company based in Saskatoon, their role in taking the non-renewable resources of the last remaining colony in Africa, Western Sahara, in contravention of international law. So Potash Corps has an agreement with a company owned by the Moroccan king, which is the occupying power in Western Sahara, to take phosphates from that country. I submitted this op-ed to the op-ed editor, the Star Phoenix, who I'd had a number of experiences with previously working for a labor union. And his response was to say, quote, "This issue has been on our pages in the past, with both sides of the debate making their points." I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, because I hadn't really heard much about the issue, and I didn't think the Star Phoenix had dealt with the issue. So I did a search of the Star Phoenix database about Potash Corps' role in Western Sahara. What I found was one letter to the editor 2.5 years earlier that was 264 words long, criticizing Potash Corps, and a rebuttal from a company spokesperson. So for the op-ed editor at the Star Phoenix, the whole debate has been had. We've given it 264 words. Let's move on to more important things like what Kim Kardashian is up to or something like that. Another example of this bias, personal example, is I blog for the Huffington Post. And basically what that is they don't pay you anything. They make you do all the work. They make you put in all the links to all the citations, etc. So they basically try to offload all the work onto unpaid people. But so it's not very glamorous. But because they have a certain reach that some of the left-wing media that I write for usually, I often submit stuff to them. The stuff I think there's a chance that they'll run. The conclusion I've come to now is that it's sort of an inverse relationship between how good of or how interesting an op-ed I submit and the likelihood of them publishing it, right? So basically, the worse it is, the higher likelihood they'll publish it because it means it's not very controversial and it's not really saying all that much of interest. But anyways, so they've refused to publish many of my op-eds for what I deem to be political reasons. But on 2 occasions, they were quite explicit about this. About a year ago, I wrote an op-ed dealing with the responsibility to protect doctrine. People familiar with the responsibility to protect doctrine? Yeah. Some people? Maybe. Well, for those who are not familiar, basically it's a doctrine that the Canadian government has been pushing, going back to the Chrétien, the Paul Martin governments, that in the international sphere, which basically says that when there's massive human rights violations taking place somewhere, it's the responsibility of the international community to intervene to stop those human rights violations. Something that sounds good on paper. How could you be opposed to stopping massive human rights violations? But in practice, no one ever says, let's intervene in Washington when Washington is responsible for massive human rights violations somewhere. So effectively, it becomes a tool of the powerful to be used against the weak. And in this Huffington Post op-ed I submitted, I cited the responsibility to protect doctrine. Specifically, I cited the fact that Canadian officials had cited the doctrine to justify overthrowing Haiti's elected government in 2004. And so I put a link in to an article based upon accessed information documents showing that the Canadian ambassador in Port-au-Prince cited the responsibility to protect doctrine. Another article based from interview with the former minister, Denis Paradis, who was largely responsible for Canadian policy in Haiti, also mentioning the responsibility to protect doctrine. I submitted this paragraph citing the Haiti example alongside other examples to the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post editor's response was to say, quote, "We need mainstream sources to verify the facts in your blog, and unfortunately the facts below are only in the publications cited or printed elsewhere by the same authors." So basically the editor at the Huffington Post was saying that because this information had not already appeared in the corporate media, it could not appear on their website. So for somebody who's trying to challenge the dominant narrative in Canadian foreign policy, let's just say that makes the bar pretty high. It puts the bar pretty high in terms of being able to challenge it. How many people in this room have heard of something called the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti? Some people? I know some people have. Many, maybe fewer than I thought. Basically, it was a meeting that Canadian government officials called in early 2003 to plot the overthrow of the elected government in Haiti. And on January 31st and February 1st of 2003, Canadian officials brought top officials from the Bush administration in the US, from the minister from the French government, top officials from the Organization of American States. And as reported on L'Actualité magazine on March 15th, 2003, they decided that Aristide, the elected president, must go. Haiti should be put under UN trusteeship, and the Haitian military should be recreated. 13 months later, Aristide is ousted by a coup that he says is US, France, Canada-backed coup. Haiti has been essentially under UN trusteeship since that time, and the Haitian military has been partly recreated. So everything that was reported on at the time that was discussed at this meeting transpires. So I did a Canadian newsstand search of major dailies in this country for a mention of the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. I could not find one single mention by a corporate reporter in the English language discussing the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. So here you have the Canadian government literally plotting to oust an elected government of the most impoverished nation in the hemisphere. The coup is then responsible for thousands of people being killed, and no one in the corporate media, except a couple mentions by Haiti solidarity activists in broader opinion pieces, even bothered to ever mention the meeting, let alone do an investigative report into the meeting. So that's a pretty extreme example of bias in the dominant media, one that I go into in the book. Another example, a more recent example of bias in the dominant media on international affairs is, so the Green Party passed a resolution in support of boycott divestment sanctions on Israeli institutions profiting from the occupation. They passed that at their convention in August by more than 2/3 majority. It was also passed in an online poll in the lead up to the convention by a very strong majority. According to a Canada Land search, a media watchdog group in Toronto, Canada Land searched what it said is a couple dozen articles about the Green Party passing that resolution. They could not find not one of those articles quoted a proponent of the resolution. So even though more than 2/3 of the Green Party supported the resolution at the convention, many more pre-convention, all the stories quoted opponents within the party, notably Elizabeth May, or those outside of the party critical, people like the Israeli ambassador, challenging the resolution. And I actually did a couple of events 2 weeks ago or so with the author of the resolution, Dimitri Lascaris, and he described how he actually gave this, in one instance, he gave a very extensive interview to a Globe and Mail reporter about the resolution, what motivated the resolution, and nothing of his interview appeared in the paper the next day. Another example, extreme example of bias in Canadian foreign policy coverage in the dominant media is that the Canadian government has signed foreign investment promotion protection agreements with more than 10 African governments over the past decade or so. And basically these foreign investment promotion protection agreements, what they do is they give multinational corporations the ability to sue local governments in international tribunal for lost profits. So in that sense, they supersede state courts, so undermine democracy in that way. They also undermine democracy in the sense that they're locked in for 16 years. So if one African government signs a FIPA with Canada, future governments that may want to change direction are beholden to that accord for over a decade and a half. I could not find one single critical mention in the English language major media outlet of a FIPA that Canada has signed with an African government. And I should have mentioned, what these FIPAs are all about really is Canadian mining companies, right? Canadian mining companies dominate all across the African continent. There's more than $30 billion in Canadian mining investment. And the Canadian mining companies are often in significant conflict with local communities, right? Over ecological issues, community benefits, etc. And often quite a great deal of violence spurred by Canadian mining companies in Africa. Probably the worst example is a Barrick Gold run mine in Tanzania, where there's been at least 65 people killed by mine security, or security paid for by the mine company over the past decade. Some reports say as high as over 200 people killed. So what these FIPA agreements are about is giving Canadian mining companies that are often in a lot of controversy with local communities this added leverage over domestic governments to make sure that they don't accede to protesters, accede to communities challenging their mining interests. But like I said, I cannot find a single critical mention in a major media outlet of a FIPA that Canada signed with an African government. And in April of 2015, the Harper government signed a FIPA with the interim government in Burkina Faso, a government that was in place after a popular revolt had ousted the 27-year regime of Blaise Compaoré. And it was an interim government basically just preparing the way for elections. It was a caretaker government preparing the way for elections. The Harper government signed a FIPA with that interim government that had no pretense of electoral legitimacy. It actually brought the top military officials to Ottawa to sign the accord, which locks in future governments for more than a decade and a half. I wrote an op-ed criticizing this deal as a flagrant disregard for democracy, submitted it to major papers in this country, and of course, none of them were interested in discussing the matter. So it's my contestation that there is an extreme bias in the dominant media on Canadian foreign policy issues. Actually, it's probably worse than most people who are already critical of the corporate media even actually realize. The book goes into some of the structural explanations for this bias, right? So questions of who owns the media. You know, obviously Canadian media is owned by a small number of major corporations. That it's some of the most consolidated or concentrated media among rich countries in the world. And I list examples in the book of owners intervening in the newsroom to shape foreign policy coverage. The most extreme example in recent years is the Asper family intervening in to make their papers even more anti-Palestinian than they already were. Another structural explanation is the revenue source of media outlets, right? Media outlets receive a lot of their revenue from advertising, which mostly comes from major corporations. And in the book, I go through some of the interests of major Canadian advertising companies in certain international affairs or international perspective. So for instance, the biggest advertiser probably over the past century in this country is General Motors. For much of that time, General Motors Defense was one of the biggest arms manufacturers in this country. So General Motors, of course, had a certain interest in Canadian militarism, a certain interest in a certain type of kind of aggressive Canadian foreign policy. So the interests of advertisers tend to seep into the newsroom. Also, in terms of a structural explanation for the bias in the major media is what are the information sources? So they're reliant on major institutions that can generate news. Probably the most important one is the Canadian military, which is the biggest PR operation in the country, which I'll get into in more detail in a second. Another structural explanation is that Canadian media is highly dependent on US wire services, right? A lot of the copy in Canadian papers comes from Associated Press, from New York Times, Washington Post, which tend to have a pro-US slant to their coverage. And media outlets, like other institutions, are responsive to pressure, right? They're responsive to pressure. So when you or I write a letter to the editor or make a phone call, it might have some impact. It has a lot more impact when a powerful individual does that, and it has even more impact when a powerful institution complains about coverage of international affairs. And in the book, I list a number of examples of military-backed organizations, pro-Israel organizations, and others running flat campaigns against media outlets when they're not happy with the coverage that they're receiving in those media outlets. The book also goes through some of the history, goes into a bit of the history of the Canadian press, right? The Canadian press, the major newswire agency in this country, was set up during World War I with a major subsidy from the federal government explicitly to get more pro-war coverage into Canadian media. And the Canadian press solidified itself as the main newswire agency in this country during World War II when they worked hand in glove with the military. In one instance, it was actually a military PR official working with a unit in Europe. One day he's doing PR for the military. The next day he's working for the Canadian press, still with the same unit. So just to give a sense of how close the ties between the Canadian press and the Canadian military have been historically. I also go into a bit about the ties between the Canadian foreign policy establishment and the CBC. Another section of the book deals with information control during times of war. Right? There's been extreme information control during times of war. During World War I and World War II and the Korean War, there was censorship, formal censorship. During World War I, there was 253 news outlets in this country banned, shut down. There was records pulled off the shelf. The censor's office was going into record stores and checking out records that were deemed to be subversive in one way. The Canadian censor also banned books, movies that were available in Britain, right? Canada, of course, was fighting alongside Britain during World War I. And the censor's justification for banning media that was available in Britain, not allowing Canadians to access that information was quite interesting and I think highly pertinent until today. Basically, the censor argued that people in England were closer to the fight. They had a bigger sense that there would be a personal consequence if England or Britain lost the war. Canadians were much more distant from the fight, and the public support for the war was much more based upon idealistic sentiment. So allowing critical information to be read or watched by Canadians became that much more problematic. Why I think this is relevant until today is that most major foreign policy missions, most of the public has fairly limited personal stake in what happens. Most of us had fairly limited personal stake in the war in Afghanistan, for instance. So in that kind of context where I'm not going to be making millions of dollars from stock if Canada bombs Libya and my stocks won't go up because of that. When I have limited personal stake in the war, it's much more based upon what I think is happening, whether I think that's a benevolent exercise. So in that context, information control becomes that much more important. And the Canadian military has spent significant energies in thinking through strategies around information control during wars. So I go through some of the different strategies in recent wars. So during bombing campaigns, the Canadian military, recent bombing campaigns, the Canadian military has tried to very much suppress information, not allow reporters to interview the pilots engaged in those bombing campaigns. I'm talking about in Iraq in the early 90s, former Yugoslavia, late 90s, Libya 2011, Iraq, Syria more recently. The military has not allowed pilots to be interviewed. The justification for this has been that they're worried that pilots, that if their names appear in the paper, that their family members might be targeted back at home. So it's like a safety thing for pilots. But in fact, it's probably more to do with the fact that in terms of information in a bombing campaign, it's taking place at 25,000 feet above the sky. If you're not on that plane, you're very reliant on the military to release information. It's very difficult to gather information about what actually happened because it's so distant. But the military took a very different perspective with regards to Canada's main ground military campaign in recent years, notably in Afghanistan. Right? In Afghanistan, the military took the total opposite. They basically tried to bring reporters as close as possible, to have news gatherers see the war from the Canadian military's perspective. Of course, what I'm referring to is the embedding campaign, embedding reporters with the military, which I'm sure people are familiar with. And basically that was about bringing reporters to live on the base with the soldiers, to go out alongside Canadian troops when their light armored vehicles or their tanks went around to Afghan villages, etc. This is how Scott Taylor, military reporter, just described the embedding campaign in Afghanistan. He said, quote, "What would you say if the Romanian military occupied your town and a Romanian tank and journalist showed up at your door? You love the government they have installed and want these guys to stay. Of course, the locals are smiling when a reporter shows up with an armored vehicle and an armed patrol." Right? It isn't that surprising, but we never heard the embedding campaign described like that in major media outlets. So the military, like I said, took a very different position, has taken very different position with ground campaigns than air bombing campaigns. And none of this is haphazard, right? As I mentioned, the military is the largest PR organization in this country. They devote significant resources, time to thinking through different types of information control strategies during different type of campaigns, what they can get away with, technological changes, et cetera, et cetera. As part of the military's PR strategy, they obscure the scope of their PR strategy. As part of their PR strategy, they obscure the scope of the PR strategy. So we don't actually know how vast their PR exercises are, or the PR capacities are, operations are, but we know they're very vast. They're quite significant. And most of this information comes from Embassy Magazine. I believe there's chairs in the room next door if anybody wants a chair. So according to Embassy, access information document Embassy had uncovered from about 2010, the military spent $354 million on its PR operations and war commemorations. They devoted 661 staff members to those exercises. The Department of National Defense, according to an internal documents, has, quote, over 13 independent public affairs organizations just within the military. There's 13 different PR bodies, presumably dealing with different elements of the military's PR strategy. Online, you can find contacts for 50 different media relations offices. In 2012, the military monitored 29,519 newspaper articles. They compile information on what they've given, what information they've given to reporters, what information reporters have reported on, which reporters tend to be more sympathetic. So who should we release information to? Who shouldn't we? The military operates dozens of publications. They spend $10 to $20 million a year on recruitment. They often spend 10, 20 plus million dollars commemorating specific wars and alongside other ministries. The military has a presence at Canada Day festivities, NHL hockey games, Santa Claus parades. So they have major kind of cultural outreach. So it is a vast PR body, both in the sense of the traditional PR dealing with the dominant media, also at the level of sort of cultural level. But it goes way beyond that. So the military has a history department, 50 employees at the military's history department. That wouldn't surprise me if that history department is almost as big as SFU's history department is. That history department's been around for a century. And they published most of the early books on Canadian war were published by the military's history department. Those books actually had to go to cabinet. So cabinet, and there's instances where cabinet discussed removing certain elements of what was in a book being published by the history department. So the military's books on Canadian war have been influential within academia and outside. Also, historians of the military history department have had influence within academia. So into the early 60s, a majority of academics dealing with war matters in Canadian universities began their careers at the history department of the military. So the military's had influence within academia like that. And there's still a lot of influence from military historians, and I should have mentioned foreign affairs historians within academia. The military, of course, also has its own university, right? The Royal Military College in Kingston is the chancellor. The chancellor is the defense minister. The military also operates or has links to what I describe as arm's length, a number of arm's length organizations, groups like the Royal Canadian Military Institute, the Legion, the Conference of Defense Associations, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Canadian Institute for Strategic Studies. All these organizations have either financial, political, or some other form of dependence on the military. Also, they tend to receive funding from arms manufacturers as well. And a lot of the stories in major media outlets that you see, they often quote individuals from these arm's length military organizations. A lot of the op-eds dealing with military affairs and major papers, they're written by individuals from these arm's length military organizations. The military also has a direct pathway into Canadian universities through something called the Security Defense Forum, set up in 1967. The Security Defense Forum funds about a dozen security studies programs at Canadian universities. And they were involved in setting up a number of those security studies programs at universities over the past couple decades. They also fund graduate work, conferences, etc. Beyond the military and its influence within academia, within think tanks, within the broader media, when you start looking at funding for social sciences programs, newly established social sciences programs at Canadian universities. It's amazing how many of them are set up with finances from wealthy Canadian capitalists, corporations, the Saudi king. In the case of the Saudi king, the Saudi king gave the University of Toronto $5.3 million in 2010 to set up something called the Chair for Dialogue Among Civilizations. In 2012, Qatar gave McGill's Institute of Islamic Studies $1.25 million. That year, David Azrieli gave $5 million to Concordia to set up the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. David Azrieli is somebody who fought with the Haganah in 1948 in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He was personally engaged in that process. And Gerald Steinberg, a noted anti-Palestinian, described the donation to Concordia as a, quote, counterattack against pro-Palestinian activism at Concordia University. The oldest school of global affairs in this country, the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, it was set up in the late 60s with in today's money, a $4 to $5 million donation from Norman Patterson, who was a Liberal Party senator, somebody who was very close to Lester Pearson, the lead architect of post-World War II Canadian foreign policy. And the initial head, and Norman Patterson School of International Affairs has incredibly close ties to external affairs, or foreign affairs, or global affairs, Canada as it's now called. The initial head was Norman Robertson, who was a long-standing Canadian diplomat, top official at External Affairs. And Norman Robertson continued to be on contract with External Affairs when he headed up the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. And in the book, I list all kinds of financial relationships between former foreign affairs people, Norman Patterson School, and many of the teachers at the Norman Patterson School are also former top Canadian diplomats. The most influential school of international affairs in this country is the Munk School of Global Affairs. Okay, are people familiar with Peter Munk? Some people? Only a few people? No? So Munk. So Peter Munk is the founder of Barrick Gold, right, which is the largest gold mining company in the world. And of 35 million Canadians, there are few that would be less credible in terms of being a source of support for the study of international affairs than Peter Munk. He is somebody who has significant personal stake in a certain type of Canadian foreign policy. So Barrick Gold has benefited from Canadian diplomatic support abroad, has benefited from Canadian aid money, has benefited from Export Development Canada support. Barrick Gold and Peter Munk have lobbied ferociously against any attempt to end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in major abuses abroad. So he has a personal major interest in certain type of Canadian foreign policy. He's also an extreme right-wing ideologue. Okay, so Peter Munk has said that Indigenous people around the world have way too many rights. It's a big problem. That gang rape is a cultural habit in Papua New Guinea because his security forces at his mine were engaged in gang rape. That Augusto Pinochet is a great guy who saved Latin America, etc. So he's on record on a whole number of fronts, saying very right-wing perspective on international affairs. As part of his initial $6.4 million donation to the University of Toronto, to set up, at that point it was called the Munk Center for International Studies, he made it so the U of T needed to receive advice from Barrick Gold's International Advisory Board. Okay, this is an academic institution receiving advice from a corporate advisory board. That included our good friend Brian Mulroney. The Barrick Gold International Advisory Board also included our good friend George Bush, Sr., the former US president, head of the CIA. Also, as part of his contract with the U of T, he didn't put all the money up front. So it was in installments, meaning that if he wasn't happy with the direction of the center, he could withdraw the rest of his funding. Peter Munk was happy with the direction of the Munk Center. He added another $5 million in 2006, and in 2010 he put up $35 million to set up the Munk School of Global Affairs, which, if people have been in the U of T campus, is right on Bloor Street, nice old building, quite nice location, etc. As part of the 2010 agreement that Peter Munk made with the U of T, he got the U of T to commit $39 million from its endowment. He also got the federal government and the Ontario government to put up a combined $50 million, and he receives a tax credit of about $16 million. So effectively, he puts up $19 million to mobilize about $100 million of mostly public funds for a school that he's had a great deal of influence over the direction of its sort of ideological kind of outlook. And it's been highly influential. It has close ties. It has a lot of resources, but it's also based in the media capital of the country. It's right downtown Toronto. So it has close ties to the Globe and Mail, for instance. The former head of the Globe and Mail, editor-in-chief, a couple days after he stepped down about a year ago, immediately had a position at the Munk School. Previous editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, same thing. Globe and Mail has a relationship with a journalism program, a relationship with the Munk School, etc. So it's been highly influential. It's also expressed a quite establishment outlook on international issues. It joined the Harper government's low-level war against Iran. In 2012, they received $250,000 for a project that was really about regime change in Iran. So they received that from Foreign Affairs. Again, this is an academic department at what is supposed to be one of the most prestigious universities in the country, receiving $250,000 from Foreign Affairs to engage in essentially a regime change effort in Iran. They've also opposed efforts to, or they've opposed the campaign to, or undermined the campaign to end public support for Canadian mining companies engaged in abuses abroad. So, to recap, the most influential school of international affairs in this country was financed, set up by an individual with a significant personal stake in a certain type of Canadian foreign policy, and somebody who's expressed extreme right-wing views on foreign policy issues. In another domain of academia dealing with international affairs, where do people think that the funding to set up international development studies programs came from? Any ideas? No thoughts?
United States.
Let's see if I can do this. Not. Any other thoughts?
Taxpayers.
More specifically?
Sita.
Exactly. So, the establishment of international development studies programs in Canadian universities is completely intertwined with our aid agency, which is, of course, an arm of Canadian foreign policy. So many of the early people who were involved in setting up IDS programs at Canadian universities had just been on Sita projects, and more concretely, much of the funding to set these programs up came from Sita, which wanted sources of support for the aid budget, effectively. That's the main interest from Sita. Between 1986 and 2006, Sita gave $250 million to Canadian universities. If you go on to the McGill's IDS website, you'll find that they list more than $1 million in contracts, funds from Sita, from IDRC, International Development Research Center, which is just another arm of Canadian aid, from Foreign Affairs. This Sita is not, while its political outlook would generally be better than the military, it's not in the business of challenging Canadian foreign policy, right? It's not in the business of funding challenges to Canadian foreign policy. That's not to say that there wouldn't be academics at
programs funded by Sita that wouldn't also be challenging Canadian foreign policy. But at a big picture level, Sita is an arm of Canadian foreign policy. And Sita has always resisted universities' attempts to have more independent sources of funding for their international work, because Sita likes to have that leverage over universities. And their funding has definitely shaped IDS, International Development Studies programs. If you look at the major journals in the domain, you'll find that they're funded by Sita. They say openly they're funded by Sita, they're funded by IDRC, another arm of Canadian aid. And the book goes into a number of the arm's length organizations tied to Sita, foreign affairs groups like the NorthSouth Institute, which was set up in the mid-1970s with funding from Sita, explicitly to have an arm's length organization to campaign or to argue for increased Canadian aid budgets. And I'm not going to get into it in detail, but Canadian aid is not what most people think Canadian aid is about. It's been a geopolitical tool, first and foremost. Secondly, a tool to advance Canadian corporate interests. So NorthSouth Institute groups like Rights and Democracy, Canadian Institute of International Peace and Security, both of those latter two organizations were set up by acts of parliament, entirely funded by foreign affairs, which of course puts some constraints on their ability to challenge Canadian foreign policy. The Canadian Aid Agency has spent tens and tens of millions of dollars on what it describes as, quote, promotion of development awareness. Between 2005 and 2008, it spent $3.5 million on articles, film, radio reports about Sita projects, basically commissioning reporters to cover Sita projects. Many of those reports appeared on global television, CTV, Ottawa Citizen. A recent example, about 2 months ago, the Ottawa Citizen published a big front page article about Canada's role in coming up with the Ebola vaccine. And it said right up front that this article was made possible with a donation or funding from the IDRC, the arm of Canadian aid. And so basically, IDRC put up the funding so the Ottawa Citizen journalist could go to West Africa to cover the story. The Ottawa Citizen sees no problem with its reporters or with it receiving funding from an arm of Canadian foreign policy to cover Canadian foreign policy. And of course, the IDRC or Sita are not generally into sending reporters to go cover a community's ecosystem destroyed by a Canadian mining company, or another project that puts Canadian foreign policy in a bad light. They, of course, are willing to put up funding to portray Canadian foreign policy in a positive way. During the war in Afghanistan, Le Devoir, what's usually viewed as a sort of progressive paper in Montreal, had a contract with Sita to, quote, remind readers of the central role that Afghanistan plays in Sita's international assistance program. So as part of the PR exercise in Afghanistan, Canada was putting hundreds of millions of dollars into Afghanistan. You know, there was a whole discussion about building schools so girls could now go to school, and that was supposed to justify our military presence in Afghanistan. But on top of that, the aid agency had contract with a major newspaper to have them go cover its projects in Afghanistan. Moving towards a conclusion, one rule of Canadian foreign policy, or ideas in Canadian foreign policy that you will not hear many places, is that the more impoverished a nation is, the greater the gap is likely to be between what Canadian officials say and do. Right? So the weaker, more impoverished a place is, the bigger the lies Canadian government officials can tell us about what they're doing. Mostly because, to a large extent, power defines reality. And there's no better example of this than Canada's role in Haiti in the mid-2000s. Our government's involved in plotting the coup, executing, militarily speaking, the coup, backing the coup government that is responsible for thousands of people being killed. Our aid money was going to supporting the coup government, including top officials within the coup government were actually employees of Sita. and US aid. Our aid money was going to supporting a Haitian police force and Canadians, Sûreté de Québec and RCMP, that were training a Haitian police force that was responsible for going into the slum neighborhoods and massacring people, firing on unarmed demonstrations over and over again. So this was our aid. What our government was telling us is this was a sign of our benevolence to Haiti, to Haitians. But in fact, it was going to supporting the torturers of the majority poor in Haiti. But this was benevolence in this country. And you ask yourself, how is that possible that the gap between reality and perception could be so big? And it gets down to the question of what capacity do the victims of Canadian policy in Haiti have to tell the world their story of what Canadian foreign policy meant, versus what capacity Ottawa had, Paris, Washington, the Haitian elite have to tell their story about what's going on. And of course, all the resources are on the side of those forces behind the coup. Just to give one quick example, just before the Aristide government was overthrown, the entire national budget of a country that has a highly centralized public administration was just under $300 million US. Canada's military's PR budget is almost certainly substantially more than that. Just what we know, it's over 300 million. And let alone the Pentagon's PR budget, State Department, Foreign Affairs, Paris, Haitian elite, et cetera, et cetera. So you have an incredible imbalance of resources, and that allows politicians to be able to really do whatever they want and lie in quite extreme kind of ways. It's my opinion, as I mentioned earlier, that the bias in the dominant media in this country on foreign policy issues is worse than most people can imagine. Some of us may be engaged in specific issues, so if we're engaged in pro-Palestinian activism, we understand that there's incredible bias against the Palestinian perspective in the dominant media. But it's almost impossible to be knowledgeable about that many different foreign policy issues. So while we know that there's a big bias on the issue that we know something about, on issues that we know almost nothing about, how do we know whether that bias is being expressed as well? So it's my opinion that that bias is in favor of the corporate/powerful perspective is across the board, and it's incredibly extreme. But it isn't complete. It's not complete within the dominant media, and it's not complete more generally within ideological institutions in this country. It's significant, but not complete. So for instance, we're allowed to have this meeting, right? We're not in a totalitarian system. We're allowed to have this meeting. You can in certain settings, you can challenge Canadian foreign policy. Even within major media outlets, it's not complete. And I have some personal experience with that, most notably with the Montreal Gazette. So the Montreal Gazette, and I should say actually a specific reporter at the Montreal Gazette named Sue Montgomery. Sue Montgomery was the person that the Gazette dispatched to Haiti in the days before the 2004 coup. She was completely duped by Canadian officials in Haiti and by some arm's-length Canadian organizations operating in Haiti. And so at one point she was robbed when she was in Port-au-Prince. And the Canadian ambassador told her that it was the Chimère that had robbed her. The Chimère were purported pro-Aristide thugs. And that the Aristide had told the Chimère to target international journalists because he wasn't happy with the coverage he was receiving, and told Sue Montgomery that she should tell other reporters staying at the Hotel Montana, where most international reporters stay in Port-au-Prince, that the Chimère on Aristide's orders were targeting international journalists. Sue Montgomery, not knowing any better, did that. She told other reporters, and of course her coverage of what was going on in Haiti was terrible at the time. It was completely making the case for the US, Canada, France coup. Sue Montgomery over the next 2 years will do a 180-degree turn, to the point where by early 2006, the federal government elections in this country, she actually wrote a column saying that Pierre Pettigrew, Canada's foreign minister at the time, and Denis Coderre, who was the special representative on Haiti for the Paul Martin government, that they should lose their seats for their role in undermining Haitian democracy. The reason why she does this 180-degree turn is because, or a number of reasons. One, that with time, when she got some distance from the situation in Haiti and started thinking about what the ambassador had told her and others had told her, it made no sense. Also, a group that I was part of, Haiti Action Montreal, we campaigned on this issue and we publicly criticized Sue Montgomery's coverage. We sent it to her, and that annoyed her. Simultaneously, we organized events in Montreal where we brought up speakers from Haiti. We brought people that were putting forward a different perspective of what Canada was doing in Haiti, and quite frankly, a more credible, a sensible perspective of what was going on in Haiti. And that also influenced Sue Montgomery's perspective. Also, we campaigned more generally. We put up tens of thousands of Canada out of Haiti stickers all across downtown Montreal. We organized demonstrations. Basically, we changed the sort of political climate, not as broad as we would have wanted, of course, but within people who were paying attention at all. We changed the political climate. We put forward a different perspective, and that influenced Sue Montgomery's changing her position. And because Sue Montgomery had become the in-house expert on Haiti at the Montreal Gazette, when she changed her position, that opened space for other reporters to put forward some of what Haiti Action Montreal was saying about Canada's role in Haiti. And we were able to actually start getting a bit of, not far from what we deserved or what the issue deserved, but we were to get a bit of a challenge to Canadian policy in Haiti into the Montreal Gazette. So even specific corporate media papers that have immense structural biases against challenging power, you can still have some influence within those papers. Now, really, to end, the main explanation for why there is not, why the bias is so stark in the dominant media, in beyond that, in ideological institutions more generally around Canadian foreign policy, is there isn't a countervailing force on foreign policy. There really isn't a countervailing force challenging the corporate elite perspective on Canadian foreign policy. On domestic issues, there is a bit of a countervailing force to the corporate perspective. Labor unions, most notably, right? Labor unions with many different problems do provide somewhat of an institutional check to the overwhelming power of the corporate perspective. That doesn't exist on foreign policy issues, and it's my opinion, or I know that if we want to push back against the 600 people working for the military and PR, the however many people, hundreds of people working for foreign affairs in PR, the probably into the hundreds of people working for the mining industry, global Canadian mining industry in PR. If we want to push back against that, we need to build that countervailing force. One of the things that I'm doing as part of this tour is setting up something called the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Basically, it's going to be initially just an online hub of critical information around Canadian foreign policy, with time be a full-fledged left-wing foreign policy think tank that will produce reports, potentially even have chapters across the country. There's a sign-up sheet over there if people want to put their email down. So that's one piece of the countervailing force, but be it a left-wing foreign policy institute, be it rebuilding the peace movement in this country, be it the international solidarity organizations on Palestine, on Haiti, and mining solidarity, be it building up progressive independent media that's willing to challenge power on some of these issues. We need to build that countervailing force. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.